The Ottoman Empire was certainly one of the greatest empires in the course of history. Its vast territories, profound economic establishments, and its socio-cultural structure provided it with a place in history's Hall of Fame. From the collapse of the Byzantine Empire to the conquest of Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire played a prominent role in the world. As with any great empire in history, the Ottoman Empire also had a humble origin. Today we will discover together how the Ottoman Empire was founded and how they managed to become a player in the big league. Let's understand who the Ottomans were. Ottoman or Osmanlı in Turkish was the name of the state founded by Osman, a Turkish leader. He would establish the foundations of the state, and his offspring would move on to turn the initially small state into an empire in less than 2 centuries. The descendants of Osman were called the Sons of Osman or Osmanoğulları in Turkish, and the established Ottoman dynasty would stay on the throne for 624 years. This was quite unusual at those times, as many thrones around the world witnessed several royal houses throughout the course of history. For example, the English throne has been dominated by 7 different royal families in the last 800 years. To understand the conditions which gave birth to the Ottoman state, we would need to understand the political and cultural structure of Anatolia at that time. This is kinda a big deal, because Anatolia was the starting point of the empire. It is also important to comprehend the problems the Islamic world was having at that time, because the Ottomans were followers of Islam and their loyalty to the religion was a foundational aspect of their cultural structure. So let's see what was up and what was down at that time. The Mongols had ravaged the Anatolian lands and had put an end to the Islamic dominance in the east and central Anatolia. They had replaced the majority of the old Turco-Islamic Seljuk rule with a Mongolian state called the Ilkhanate. They didn't like the Muslim Turkomans like the Ottomans and carried out close relations with the enemies of Islam, including the Byzantine Empire. Almost constant fighting with the Mongols in the east and the Byzantine forces in the west drove the independent Muslim lords of Anatolia into a fight for survival. This hostile environment led to the foundation of a new social entity. There came to be a social class of minor lords who would settle on the frontiers with their people and constantly fight with their enemies to protect the inner territories and the Muslims living within them. The members of this social class were called Alps. They were religious warriors who fought to ensure the well-being of Islam. Osman, the founder of the Ottoman state, was an Alp. His life was defined by a struggle to keep his people alive and his religion intact in a hostile environment. Osman was actually born into a time of hope. The Mamluk Sultanate in the south had started beating the Mongols and eventually took the fight to their lands, Anatolia. Sultan Baybars of the Mamluk Sultanate entered Anatolia to encourage the Muslim lords to keep up their fight. The distress of Mongols meant that the Byzantine Empire had lost its double enemy card against the Muslim Turkomans. After decades of bitter struggle and toil, there was hope for the Muslim Turks of Anatolia to rebuild the civilization they had lost. Osman and his fellow warriors were mainly fighting with Byzantine forces on the frontier in the lands of western Anatolia. The Byzantine administration had something of a border defense force from a variety of fighters, including some Turkish tribes who had supported the Mongols. Osman was a fierce fighter, and his consistent motivation inspired many to join him in his fight. The fact that Osman was a vicious fighter does not mean that he rushed into battle mindlessly. He was an effective strategist. Rather than just waging war on the fields for the sake of plunder, He aimed to capture strategic points such as castles and wanted to capture major Byzantine cities so that his people would have a place to settle down for good. He knew the importance of qualified civilization quite well and had understood early on that his state would need sustainable cities to survive and thrive in the long term. Osman was not unrealistic. He knew that the Byzantine forces could not be taken out with short-term moves. The Byzantine Empire was able to gather forces many times larger than the tribe of Osman at times of war. So, provoking the Byzantine army into forming a single massive force and dealing with them on the battlefield was not an option. The Byzantine forces had to be forced into division so that they could be isolated and eliminated. The task was challenging, but it was not impossible for the Ottomans. They had origins in the steppes of Central Asia, where warfare was quite often carried out on horseback. Thanks to their accumulated nomadic experience on the horseback, Osman and his allies were able to maintain hit-and-run tactics to tire and isolate their enemies. The Byzantine forces were using fortifications and castles to maintain support for major cities and towns. Osman knew that he had to neutralize and conquer these to achieve a better grip on the Byzantine hinterland. Once again, their swiftness worked in favor of the Turks, and by the beginning of the 14th century, they had gained a significant amount of control over the lands in Bithynia. The time had come to lay siege to major cities. Osman took action and laid siege to Nicaea. He also blocked the supply paths to the port city of Nicomedia, forcing the city into famine. The Byzantine Emperor, Michael, moved out with an army. The army he had gathered was larger than Osman's forces, and this convinced the Turks to retreat for a brief duration. The emperor did not chase them and kept waiting at Magnesia. The Turks who had retreated did not cancel their campaign completely. Instead, they started their raids around Magnesia and eventually drove the emperor and his army into despair. Once again, their swiftness had become a menace for their enemies. The emperor was abandoned by his troops and had to escape. Under the leadership of Osman, the Turks continued their operations. Andronikos II, Emperor Michael's father, intervened and sent a force to relieve the city of Nicomedia. The Turks met the Byzantine forces who had freshly disembarked from their ships at Bappeus, a plain field near the city. Osman led a light cavalry charge against the Byzantine forces and broke their formations. The victory was decisive. Osman's fame increased greatly after the victory. His reputation spread over Anatolia as one of the main leaders who was taking the fight to the enemy. More and more fighters joined his ranks to take part in his campaigns against the Byzantine Empire. The victory at Bappeus provided Osman with the legitimacy he needed to establish his house as a completely independent lordship. This lordship would become a state with a number of small towns, castles, and its own institutions. Although he maintained the sieges on Nicomedia and Nicaea, he was unable to take them in his own lifetime. It was Orhan, Osman's son, who would fulfill his father's dream by capturing major cities and turning the new Ottoman state into one of the most prominent states of its own time.